Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we've already talked about observation as we look at the text, but now we're going to move to the process of interpretation in our continuing study of biblical interpretation. As we set out upon our interpretive journey, we are faced with several fundamental questions. First of all, we ask the question, what did it mean? And remember, interpretation is asking not just what does it say, but what does it mean? First of all, we ask, what did it mean to the original characters of the narrative? Now, that's assuming we're looking at a part of the scripture that contains narrative. We're going to see a number of genres, but right now I want to speak just about narrative interpretation. For example, we might take the book of Genesis. There are characters. There's Adam and Eve, and there's Noah, and there's Abraham, and the storyline has a certain meaning to them because they were experiencing certain things. I don't stop there, though. I next go to the question of what did it mean to the author of the narrative, and that's an entirely different question. Because I might have had Adam and Eve, or Noah, or Abraham, but they weren't the author of the text. The author comes and writes at a later date. I'm assuming, just for the sake of argument, not going to go into the details, that Genesis through Deuteronomy are written by Moses. They are called the books of Moses elsewhere in the scriptures. And so I think it's appropriate to ask the question, what did these books mean to Moses as he is writing, and to his original recipients as they are reading the text? And that brings us to the next question. Not only what did it mean to the author, but what did it mean to his audience, the original recipients of those books? All books are written with a particular audience in mind, and Moses, as he's writing, has a particular audience in mind. What did this story, the different parts of the stories, mean to those original recipients? For example, we take the story of Adam and Eve. They're being cast out of the garden. And of course, we put ourselves into their shoes, or lack thereof, as the case may be, and we imagine what that would have been like. But we don't stop there. We notice that Moses is writing this, and he's writing this to the Israelites, who themselves have left a very garden-like place, because Egypt is described in terms of a garden, and they're no longer in Egypt as they're receiving the book of Genesis and its story of Adam and Eve cast out of the garden. They haven't been cast out, but they've been released, and they've left the quote-unquote Garden of Egypt, and now they're in a wilderness place. So perhaps as they're reading this for the first time, they can imagine what Adam and Eve are going through, and they can both compare and contrast their situations. We don't stop there. We also notice that we have a completed Bible, and we're living in the 21st century. And so as we are reading it today, we want to interpret it and eventually apply it to our own lives. And so we look at the story in three different ways. First of all, from the point of view of the original participants of the story. Then from the original writer and the original recipients of the story. That's a different group. That's Moses and the Israelites in this case. And then we have the Bible in its completed form, and we look at it today from our perspective. Next, we ask the question, what does it mean in light of New Testament revelation? Because the New Testament sheds light on the Old Testament. It gives us a more fuller picture. It helps us to more fully understand God's completed revelation. Let's take another example. This is Genesis chapter 15. As a covenant ceremony is described, God has made some promises to Abraham, has promised that he's going to give him a son, and Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Of course, the New Testament tells us a little bit about that. And so God says to Abraham, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And he brought all these to him and cut them in two. Now that sounds weird to us. But to Moses, the writer of this, and the Israelites as the recipients of this story, it's a very familiar story, as it would have been familiar to Abraham, because cutting animals involved the making of a covenant. Indeed, you didn't make a covenant, you actually cut a covenant, and that's what's taking place here. Abraham brings these animals to the presence of the Lord, and he cuts them in two. Now, what would take place? You'd cut these animals in two, and then the parties entering into the covenant would pass between the pieces of the animals, and what you were signifying is that if I don't keep my word, then may what happened to these animals happen to the one who breaks the covenant. And Abraham brings these animals, and he cuts them in two, lays each half opposite the other. He didn't cut the birds. And it came about when the sun had set, it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. Now it's evident to us, as it would have been evident to Abraham and to Moses and the Israelites who's writing this, and the original recipients, that this is the presence of the Lord that is passing between the pieces. God is making a covenant, binding himself with a covenant to Abraham. Now that's pretty obvious, and just in case it wasn't, we read in verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant. The Hebrew text actually says God cut a covenant. The Lord cut a covenant with Abraham, or Abram as he's called at this point. However, notice how the presence of God is described. He's described in terms of a smoking oven and a flaming torch. And of course, one interpretive question that we ask is, why was the presence of God described that way, as a smoking oven and a flaming torch? Why not just say the presence of God moved through it? Well, perhaps, this is visual, but I think there's a more immediate reason, and it's seen, the reason for that description is seen in who is writing this and to whom it is being written. It's Moses writing this, and he's writing to the Israelites in the wilderness, and it is their current experience as they're reading this. You can sort of imagine them. They're in a camp in the wilderness around the tabernacle, and there over the tabernacle in the daytime is a pillar of smoke, and at night there is a pillar of fire. In other words, there is a smoking oven and a flaming torch that symbolizes the presence of God among them. And now we read that same presence of God, that smoking oven, that flaming torch, was there to pass between the pieces of these animals to make a covenant with their ancestor, with Abram. It's only when you read the book in light of the original author and the original recipients that you see these additional clues.